All right. Thank you all for joining today's webinar. We're going to be discussing some work we've done with Verizon on helping them train for certain soft skills. Before we get started, I just wanted to note a few housekeeping items. If you have questions along the way, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type in questions there. And then afterwards, after the recording is wrapped, we'll be able to make that available for you guys so you guys can have an on-demand version of this webinar. All right, so welcome. I'm Michael Casale, as it says on the bottom there. I'm the Chief Science Officer at Strivr. My background is in the behavioral sciences, so I have a doctorate in something called cognitive neuroscience, where I spent a lot of time researching and learning about different learning behaviors and the brain areas that kind of go along with that. Now at Strivr, I'm helping to kind of take that research and infuse it in our methodology, in our approach for how we actually design and develop training, and then also how do we uncover new analytic insights with this new technology. And I'll discuss that in a little bit more detail in just a few moments. And before we actually bring our other guest, Cleo Scott, on, I want to give you guys a little bit of a background for how we do things at Strivr, and then how that leads us to provide really good training for these soft skills that we're going to discuss in just a few moments. So a little bit of background on Strivr. About 5 years ago, we started our Strivr journey. So this company was actually started as a thesis project at Stanford University in collaboration with our co-founder, Dr. Jeremy Bailenson, who runs the Virtual Human Interaction Lab at Stanford. And at that lab, they study a lot of how people are using technologies like VR to interact with other humans. So the concept of how do we actually learn about optimal human interaction, interpersonal skill development, et cetera, all that work was already going on at Stanford. And then as part of a thesis project, really wanted to understand how we could apply that technology to other modalities of learning. And in that case, it was actually focused on sport, American football of all things. So we got our start basically looking at how to use this technology that was being used to understand other types of human behavior, to understand how it could actually work for athletes learning in sporting environments, like the NFL, like the NCAA, et cetera. So we worked with a bunch of football teams for a few years. And then all of a sudden came our first enterprise customer. So the idea being, you know, a company like Walmart starting to look at this technology as not just for football players, but something that they can use to also train their own employees. And the idea is actually kind of not a crazy novel insight, because if you think about what has to happen in terms of learning behavior on the football field, there's a lot of similarities to what has to happen in the enterprise space, Walmart being a great example of that. And then, of course, since then, we work with a bunch of other top Fortune 500 companies, as you see listed there below. So we've really been able to start really to get the most out of our training for these enterprise customers by working with a variety of different applications. And we're really seeing the utility of this technology in a lot of different industries and a lot of different domains. Okay, you're going to hear a lot about this word today. This is immersive learning, and this is the idea that we're going to be able to teach someone through this new technology, these new immersive technologies, in a way that they've never been able to access learning and training before. And the way that we define immersive learning, as stated here, is an experiential training methodology combining the sense of presence of virtual reality with learning theory, data science, and spatial design. And I've touched on this a little bit already, the idea that we're really able to infuse the best of what we know about the world of research. I mentioned Dr. Bailenson's work, my own work, in terms of understanding kind of how people learn, how people can kind of use the idea of presence and immersion to optimize learning environments. And then, of course, we think about things like analytics and the insights that we get to really understand behavior in a way that we've never been able to understand it in these training environments before. That's our data science team. And then, of course, spatial design, kind of making it all come together in a really cohesive, engaging manner in the content that we create. Another key thing for us, too, in the way that we approach our work is that we really want to work from this idea of business objectives, right? So I've seen, and I'm sure you guys have maybe seen, a lot of really interesting, cool-looking content in VR. What's really important is that that content, and that content that we eventually use for training, supports business objectives. In other words, just having VR for the sake of VR and just having VR that maybe looks cool isn't enough. It's really important that we're matching all the things that are good about immersive learning to something useful and valuable in these business objectives. And so whenever we create content, whenever we create training with immersive learning, we're always kind of keeping these business objectives in mind. And I'll talk in a second about what that looks like. But here are some examples of what we mean by business objectives. So we might want to reduce the cost of incidents like safety incidents. We might want to decrease food safety incidents, other emergency situations. We think about active shooter, robberies, et cetera. Those are things that are business objectives. And again, providing training with immersive technologies can uniquely address those. In some cases, that cannot be addressed with other modalities of training. Efficiency and productivity, obviously, if people are learning a new process or are getting on board and need to learn any kind of new kind of information that's coming their way that is going to help them do their job better, oftentimes this immersive technology is able to address that better. Enhancing customer service. So we're going to talk a little bit about soft skills today. And so this is another really big one, right? So how do you actually create an environment where people can be trained to be better with other people, right? It's really hard to get that simulation in any other environment. And so it's really important when we think about creating the technology and creating the content that we're able to really tie that back to something useful in terms of a business objective. And so here's actually what that looks like when we talk about our Strivr methodology and the way that we work with customers to really address those business objectives and to really understand how to use the technology most effectively. So we start here kind of at the top left of this graph with the strategy, right? So at the very beginning, again, we're not just kind of creating content hoping that it's going to be useful for someone. We're being very deliberate about thinking about the business needs of the organization. And then how does that result in specific training that we want to go do? And so we're always connecting the dots between what's a good training to service these business needs. And we work with our partners often with that objective in mind. And then we get to the curriculum design phase. Of course, this is really important, thinking about what is the training going to look like, right? What are the key elements of the learning that have to happen for that training to be successful? And so we start to map that out, again, hand in hand with our customers, our partners. And then we get to actual content production side. And so, not only do we have the expertise when we think about curriculum design and all the kind of learning theory that we're able to infuse into that curriculum, but then we also have expertise in the content production. And so this is a really important point too, because if you have a really good curriculum design, but don't execute well against what the content is going to look like, especially now that you're dealing with this immersive technology that needs that expertise, things may not be effective as effective as you want them. And that kind of goes hand in hand with number 4 in the experience building. Number 5 is another really important point. So along the way, working with all these customers, we realized there was a strong need not just to know all these other preceding steps about building the right training to meet these learning and support these, the right training to support these business objectives, and then also the content expertise to execute around that curriculum design, but also how to implement. These new technologies require something a little bit different than what a lot of our customers are used to. So we bring some expertise when it comes to implementation and rollout. And then, of course, the kind of closing the loop here with our data analytics and insight, getting information about, did the training work, how effective it was. We can get information on an individual level basis, too, to understand differences between different learners as well, which is often important for our customers. And so we've realized that providing that holistic solution is really critical if we're able to really support an effective learning environment. So learning effectiveness is not just any one of these, it's really all of these that need to come together. And we've, over the years, crafted an expertise around this methodology and are able to apply it. And we'll talk about the Verizon example in just a minute. One of the things that we often talk about too is in kind of the idea of immersive learning is the immersive learning has greater effectiveness compared to other modalities. But as I mentioned just a second ago, the effectiveness is kind of all for naught if you can't actually figure out a way to implement and scale. The good news is immersive learning does both of these things really well. So when we think about kind of important features for kind of learning modalities or training modalities, we think about kind of 2 of the more prominent benefits or features that need to be accounted for, which is the effectiveness of the learning, of course. So that medium, how effective is it in teaching? And then, of course, how can you scale it? Because if you can't scale it, it's not going to reach many people, not really that effective. So that's where immersive learning starts to shine, is it really kind of gets the best of both worlds in both the learning effectiveness and the scalability. And you can see, in contrast to other modalities, how that really stacks up. Manuals, right? Probably the most scalable thing we can think of doing is getting a pamphlet in everyone's hand. But how effective is that really? Can they really start to translate those words into action in the real world? And we're finding a lot of customers are actually choosing immersive training and immersive learning environments over manuals for that very reason. Expert mentorship is often really effective, right? Having someone there one-on-one is super useful. You can ask questions, they can guide you at every step of the way. Not very scalable, it requires a human. And so for every person you need to train, it also needs another human there to be in that kind of expert mentoring environment. And then, of course, there's other modalities. We talk about e-learning, classroom, et cetera, and they fall all along these continuum. But we don't believe anything captures kind of, again, the best of both of these dimensions of scalability and effectiveness quite like the immersive technologies and the immersive learning that we're creating. And then when we think about soft skills, so one of the things that I think is really valuable for these immersive technologies is their application to soft skills. And so when we think about, a lot of the training that we've done in the past, safety training, et cetera, I think there's a lot of obvious reasons why being in that environment is really important. But it's maybe even more the case for soft skills, that being there is actually going to produce a much better response. And especially if you think about how that training happens now. In e-learning environments, you're often kind of seeing things modeled for you in a passive way. You maybe see from a third-person perspective, two people interacting, maybe some narration and some voiceover. And from there, you're supposed to abstract what you're supposed to do without really ever acting. That's really difficult when we think about soft skills for anybody to really learn anything effective. That practice isn't there. Other modalities, role play is another prominent one, do actually encourage that real world interaction. But frankly, as we've kind of explored that environment of role play learning, as well as, just talking to customers and anecdotally, we're realizing that role plays don't often cut it either. It's not something that people can take seriously. It doesn't scale very well. And therefore, you don't actually have a lot of that kind of, real world sense that you're there talking to someone else and practicing with someone else. And so one of the other things that's great about soft skills is not just their ability to train, as I just mentioned, all the reasons why immersive learning is good for that. And we'll talk about the Verizon case in a second, but also the analytics. So here on this slide are just a couple of examples of some of the early analytics that we're able to get. And the cool thing about the way that we approach soft skills training is we're actually able to use speech data. So we put people in these real world conversations, these real world interactions, and we can actually record what they're saying in real time. And then we can do something useful with that speech. We can look at, how fluent they were with their words. And in this case, we're also looking at the proportion of I words versus we words. And we can see how that changes over time with training and if they're actually kind of doing what they're supposed to. And these are really kind of useful measures for us because it tells us something about performance at the end of the day. I won't go into too much detail now because we won't have time. We want to make sure that we have a really kind of lengthy, good discussion with Cleo. But I just want to preview the fact that, these data types that we get from real world conversations are real world in the sense that, you're simulating this experience by interacting with another are so important for the usefulness of what we can actually provide in terms of the training. Because you really get a sense at that point of how good people are in these situations. You don't really get a sense of that through e-learning modules or through role-playing modules, certainly not with kind of reading a manual, et cetera. So we're pretty excited about all of that when it comes to using immersive technologies and our immersive learning approach to training soft skills. Okay, so with that said, I want to make sure that we introduce Cleo Scott, who's going to talk about our work with Verizon in using our Strivr immersive training and immersive learning approach to help them with a real problem that they had with their folks to develop new soft skills. So Cleo, I want to welcome you to the webinar. Thanks for coming along and sharing some of the insights and wisdom that you have from our work. And I guess to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your journey with Verizon?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. My journey in Verizon or to Verizon, or as I've been in Verizon, has sort of come my way since I worked for a company that was acquired by Verizon in 2006. So, as part of that amazing acquisition of MCI, we all became one family of Verizon. And there were so many similarities in culture and similarities in how the companies operated, especially when it came to employee development and opportunities. So I came through many different functions like marketing, customer service, into learning and development. And now this is my home. So it's been an amazing journey. And to answer your question about what excites me, what I'm passionate about, that hasn't really changed over time or throughout the journey. It's been a couple of things I would say. It's the technology space that we're in. And there was a time when that technology seemed to move pretty quickly, but the pace at which it's moving now, it just makes that look so slow. So we've had an amazing time in terms of technology in this industry and in our company. But then also, I think we attract a certain type of people, and we have fun together. So it's really awesome to work in a company where we're like-minded and we actually enjoy working with each other.
Great. That's really useful for us to know a little bit about your journey. I'm definitely interested in your take on using virtual reality to help with some of those initiatives that you have going on at Verizon, and what is it about the technology itself that's really attracted you?
Yeah, so we started with virtual reality. I think it was in 2019 in our space, and that was after we looked at the effect it had when we saw it in another segment of the business, and the type of reaction people had to it. So we thought maybe something we should look at. But we'd also looked at other aspects of immersion in other technologies as well. But for us, in the business group, particularly in the support space, the need we had was to immerse people in an experience with a customer before they could actually practice that on the customer. So that's sort of where the need came from when we looked at the amount of time we had spent, time over time, year over year, practicing role plays and trying to do simulations and trying to get the essence of what that feels like in the moment when you're engaging with a customer, especially an irate customer. We've had success. We would go up and we would go down. We would see improvements in performance. We would plateau, then we would come down. And so we just weren't having that consistent and sustained adoption of different skills that we wanted our frontline to use to create the customer experience we're looking for. So that's when we thought, let's try virtual reality and see what that would look like.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense. And, you started mentioning a use case that you guys have found to be really compelling for VR, and I want to drill into that just a bit. So, you mentioned also that this was a particularly important thing for you guys to be able to train well. So this customer interaction, especially when, kind of emotions are high, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about, the training that you guys were doing, and then how you saw VR in particular as a way to either improve that training, and of course, we've talked a little bit about training effectiveness, using VR to be able to do these general soft skills better in a more effective way. But also I'm interested in something else you mentioned, which is the business impact that it had. So thinking about that particular use case, what did you see? What was it about VR that drew you, not just from the training effectiveness, but also from the kind of, I guess, more business focused types of impact that it was going to make? You mentioned something about, time to train, maybe efficiencies gained there, et cetera. So I'm curious to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I'll take it from many questions in one. I'll take it from the business impact perspective. And, oftentimes when we think about what we're trying to accomplish and we start there and work backwards, it often informs us of, what is the right thing to do? What are the right solutions we should be looking at? So from a business impact perspective, I think oftentimes when people think about frontline employees engaging with customers, it's usually in a customer service environment where a customer calls in, pretty innocently, has an issue, and then sometimes it escalates. The particular scenario we were dealing with, customers would only call or engage with us when something was wrong, because this was in a function where a customer's network would go down. So if you think about, when you show up at Macy's to shop and you get to that cash register, if it doesn't work, the line gets longer and longer, right? So the type of transactions that we support and the network that we provide to customers, to business customers, is important. Uptime is critical. So when a network goes down and the customer comes in, they're already irate. So it's not a build, it's immediate. Even though the engineers or the frontline folks are expecting that, it varies. So literally what could happen is my defense would be I stay on mute until the customer has calmed down, or I try to do anything to get away from that, because I don't think most people don't show up at work every day ready to be to handle an escalated customer or to be yelled at. So what we were trying to do in that scenario, thinking about, what's the impact on the business, when that network goes down, that's the customer's business. And so that becomes our business. So for us to make sure that we are responding not just quickly and not just fixing the problem, but to actually make the customer feel like they were supported and make them feel like we did all we could, we understood. And so that whole piece of how do I start with empathy, even though I know I'm dealing with a difficult situation, can sometimes be hard to how would I say it, to develop that in a classroom session, or through some sort of standard, here are the skills, here are the tips and tricks, here's the practice. And so we found even that, as you do role plays, it could come across a little fake because I'm just not that person that I'm trying to be. And so when we looked at VR and bringing that into our program, what we noticed immediately was the idea that the avatar in that scenario, which was a customer, suddenly the person who's in the seat is looking at a person talking to them and saying, oh, that is actually that customer that I heard on the phone, that voice that I only hear on the phone, or the person I'm engaging with in a chat message, it's a real person. And so I think it was the aha moment of that avatar on the screen as they were going back and forth that started to build for the employee to say, oh, I need to sit up because this is a person who's having a problem, not just a company or a number that's calling, but a person who really has, a huge network outage, and I need to act with some urgency, and I need to see what I can do to make sure I support this customer and have them leaving feeling like they were cared for, which is very different from just caring for them.
That's excellent. And I think that resonates certainly with me, and kind of thinking about the Strivr approach to soft skills and why we think these immersive technologies like VR are really valuable. You mentioned things like role plays and frankly, the inability of a lot of folks to treat that role play as they would a real customer. Now you're in a virtual reality setting. You see the customer across from you. You certainly kind of have certain elements that make you feel like it's a real conversation. And so that response that they're giving, the customer's giving, that's so important, right? To be able to know actually what to say in that moment. We talk a lot about, being able to read from a a pamphlet on what to do. Maybe there's actual steps that are delineated and written out super well, but there's nothing like actually putting that into practice. It's so hard to capture a lot of the kind of human behavioral interactions in words that are written in text. It's really important to actually do it, to be able to practice and then possibly even get feedback. So that's really great that you mentioned that. And then, like I said, it coincides well with what we're thinking at Strivr. I am curious to know also from your perspective, and I know I asked a lot of questions before, so we'll try to go through them a little bit more detail here. So training effectiveness, I think we both see the value of VR there. When it comes to the business impact, right? So that's great. Obviously, everybody wants to make people better, and you want to actually provide employees the skills that they're going to need. Can you talk a little bit about what you're thinking when you think about like this as a business kind of impact, or this is a business value add for Verizon? And how does that happen within the organization? How does that, how do those conversations in Verizon go? So people are actually looking at it not just from like, we're taking care of our employees, but this is good for the health of the business.
It's so hard to separate those because our approach in Verizon is to really focus on our employees, take care of them, and make sure they have the skills they need. Because then that's how we get the customer satisfaction. And then that's how we get shareholder value, right? So we try not to separate those. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. When I talked about the time that we've spent doing role plays and the way we've trained and then we got to VR, this particular scenario that we're talking about, we had a 4-hour workshop, standalone in person, that we would conduct to do this training around customer empathy and how we handle irate customers. But in addition to that, we had pre-work and we had post-work. And then what we would need to do also is have leaders coaching their teams around the same topic. So if you think about that, for one employee, we're probably talking about maybe up to 10 hours if we were to pull it all together at one time. When we did VR, we had, I can't remember now, so hopefully I'm not wrong in here, but I would say literally 30 minutes of immersion around the same topic. And so when you start to calculate the number of employees that we have and that we would put through this type of an experience times the number of hours, that's significant savings in terms of the time we spend, which is a cost to the company, and the time that's taken out of productivity for the employee to spend gaining that moment of, geez, this is what I need to do, how I need to react, how I need to use my time. And that's even with providing the employee time to practice, which what I loved about it was the privacy of the employee being able to practice on their own. So that's a significant cost to the business. So they're intertwined in terms of the employee with the business. The second part of that business conversation around, what it does for the business and how we get there. We sell to Fortune 500 companies. So that's a finite number of companies, which means that when you become a customer of Verizon, for one particular reason, solution, or application, you become a customer of Verizon again for many others. If your experience with us in one or two of these applications or solutions is not what it should be, then the likelihood of us getting more business or doing more business with you starts to reduce. So it's when you look at, if we don't do it right, what happens in terms of our opportunities with the same customer, or even within a particular industry, since all of these are, I would consider to be pretty closed. It's really, customer experience is really important. So I think they're kind of connected. And one drives the other.
I mean, yeah, that makes total sense. And we, when we work with customers, obviously, working with you guys, it's so important for us to be able to make that connection between what's happening in training and obviously things that are happening kind of more when it comes to like with respect to the health of the business, I guess, as I mentioned before. But you said something earlier that I want to make sure I underscore, because I think it's really important, and it's a great insight, which is, these skills that we're training, we're not training them just because we think that, people are going to enjoy this particular training. We're training them, well, that's a goal, but we're training them because we think it does have some impact on what the business is trying to do. And in this case, you mentioned that, training in this particular customer scenario that you guys were doing, that is actually going to lead to better customer, kind of basically service, right? And customers are going to appreciate that. They're going to want to, come back to Verizon, et cetera. So these skills that we're training, exactly right, like you mentioned, they directly have an impact on the business. And you guys know that ahead of time. And so it's important for us also when we're working with companies to make sure that we're very emphatic on making sure the skills that we're training are actually going to impact the business in some meaningful way. And obviously you guys are kind of way ahead of the curve there. So it's not just things.
We do both. Don't get me wrong. We absolutely invest and spend a lot of time in our employees' development, careers, and all of their personal needs, definitely. But in the area of functional training, that's always pretty much tied to what are the business priorities? What are the outcomes we're seeking? What are the gaps that are there? And why would we invest time and money in developing this particular skill? That's different. That's our functional training. But we do have our fun and employee development and all the rest of that as well.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, it's not one or the other, right? And you even mentioned at the end things around, operational efficiency, as it were, like the time to train, et cetera. One of the cool things we think about VR is it's able to solve multiple problems at once. It's not like you have to trade off anymore. You don't have to trade off engagement for effectiveness. You don't have to trade off effectiveness with time to train. You're getting all these benefits really with this one medium. At least that's how we're experiencing, and it sounds like you guys have a similar experience. So that's cool. That's great. And then I guess speaking of that, I'm really interested in kind of the details. I'm a person who's a little bit more quantitatively oriented. Are there any kind of data points or statistics you guys have been capturing around the effectiveness? Some of the things that you just started to talk about. I don't know if the data you've captured formally, or if there's any data is useful to talk about here, or even anecdotes. A lot of times, there's power in just the feedback that employees are giving to us in terms of this training was really useful. I feel more confident, et cetera. So I don't know if there's anything there you wanted to share.
Yeah, I mean, we have done, and we're still continuing the work, by the way. And I know, in the time where we can't travel and necessarily do a whole bunch of things face to face, we are looking at other ways, because it is important, and the sustained, presence and practice is critical that we do that. And so we keep measuring over time. But initially, the reaction I thought was pretty significant in two ways. One, in what we were looking to accomplish, and then also the side benefits that came with it. So, as we went in, we were looking to see how do we move from a certain, I would say, when we get feedback from customers, what were they telling us about their experience as they came into these different centers? So we looked at that, and we did see a significant improvement in how customers were being handled. But for the employees, we also saw a significant reaction to how they felt about their readiness to do their jobs. So they walked out of their first VR session with feedback like, can we use this for all of our other training? It's like, well, hold on, let's see. We never want to go, from here to all the way over there, and this is now the answer for everything. But that's how strong it was. It was also huge awareness on the part of the employee in terms of how they were showing up. I remember we had one employee say, gosh, I didn't realize how I was serving the customer. I think I would have been more irate if that's how someone was handling my call. So this huge awareness, the blind spots, everything that opened up for the employees, but then the experience itself in the VR, because we were a little concerned that some people might not respond well, whether, they wouldn't like, having the goggles on and so on. But it worked really well, and great response in terms of the technology itself and wanting to apply that to other types of training that we were doing. But then as they went back to work and we started to track with the supervisors and do the side-by-sides, we found that they were much more confident because they had more awareness of themselves, and so much more confident in handling customer calls. And we're continuing to track that through to see ultimately what are the units achieved, whether it's in customer experience or cost for the business. So no particular detailed statistics at this time on those business pieces, but we're seeing the indicators that would suggest we should have improvements over time.
Yeah, and obviously those kind of more bottom line impacts are really useful and compelling. But you said something earlier, and you brought it up again, which I think is critical, and it's really underrated in my opinion, which is this idea of providing the opportunity for employees to really feel like they're prepared and that they can be more engaged because they're going to be confident when they show up, and how they show up to work and how they show up to that particular scenario in their job, I think is so important, right? And it's that kind of empowerment that you talked about, the investment that you're making in the employee, that I think makes a huge difference. And sometimes it's really hard to capture in numbers, but you can kind of see it in the anecdotes, you can hear it in the feedback. You mentioned the one employee kind of telling you about having an awareness and a bit of an epiphany maybe. That stuff, it'd be nice for, we do a good job of trying to quantify all of that, but sometimes it's really difficult to put that in numbers. But that's really awesome that you guys have been able to have some of those experiences. And so, it's great for us.
For us, we try to be really careful about looking at direct, causation to results. Results sometimes take so long, so they're always pretty much lagging indicators, and not much you can do at that time. So for us, when we look at measuring effectiveness, we need to see whether or not there is going to be any chance that we're going to hit those numbers. So that's what we want to affect, right? Is how do we make sure people are prepared, and along the journey, they're getting better and better, because then you can be more certain, can never guarantee, but you can be more certain that you're going to have an improvement, you're going to have some result that you're looking for. So the results measurement, and especially in the enterprise world where our sales and revenue cycles are very long, we wouldn't wait to see a particular number show up to say, oh, it looks like things worked, because then you can imagine that's too late. There are also so many factors that are tied to success around a particular data point. So unless you spend the time to isolate the specific impact of a training program or any one lever, then, you're kind of shooting all over the place. So it's to narrow it to the place of what can I affect with a particular training program. And usually you're looking at the employee coming out of training. What have they learned? How much are they retaining? And what are we reinforcing? And then that's what I like about VR is you spend less time doing that because you get them there faster. And then the practice is there and they can do it on their own and they can perfect it. And then, you start to see results faster. So, results are typically for us, it's quick. It needs to be a little shorter term than the time it would take for us to get to those big business data points.
That's such a good point that, in kind of thinking about the journey to figuring out business impact, we don't want to ignore a lot of those kind of signals, those metrics that could be really useful coming out of even the shorter term training, right? So the effectiveness that we see in just the training, and knowing that we set the training up correctly from the beginning so that we can be confident when we look at the results coming out of training that there is going to be some connection to the business impact without actually having to wait for those numbers to materialize.
Yeah, and the thing with VR too is we started out with a pilot. So, typically when you're running a training program, you could literally be spending 3-6 months on a pilot before you go, oh, should we do this or not, right? But because the pace of getting that adoption and getting to what we're looking for is so much shorter, you would run the pilot and you can go launch, or you could say, no, this is not going to work. So it's pretty good. Yeah,
I mean, that obviously resonates really well with us in our approach to implementing VR. And then I guess, speaking of implementation, more kind of practically, I'm curious to know a little bit about the kind of journey to implement from your guys. It's like, what are things that you learned along the way, kind of key points, key insights when other organizations are thinking about implementing, some folks that might be on this webinar, what are some things to keep in mind when we're talking about implementing, certainly at the scale that you guys did?
Yeah, so I can get into some of the details that some people may find fun or some people may go, wow. So we're a global company, and oftentimes for people that means we start things in the US and then it happens in other parts of the world. We were bold enough to start in other parts of the world. But we were developing the story, developing the capabilities, and developing the training in the U.S. So to get it into another country, all the fun of import export around equipment and programming, we had to deal with. So from an implementation perspective, it was a little bit challenging, and we did get creative and started to offer different, types of pre-work to build up to get, our folks ready. But the implementation did involve some challenges with import-export as we were starting outside the U.S. And come back, and we were going different places around the world. So we quickly learned where we could import and export and how we would go about doing that. So we had to work through that. We also had to work through, once we got into a particular country, what would that setup look like, and how would we run a program? How would we go about sort of fitting that into a culture that might sort of look at that and go, oh, I'm not so sure about that, or people who would quickly say, yes, let me try that. So some of those, because these are places that we train all the time, but we do it the same way. So people are expecting you to come in, be in a classroom, run a class like it would, or do something over video. But having done VR before, this would be new. So it's setting the stage and helping people understand and become comfortable with the technology. Implementation also required us to have experts on hand. So as an L&D organization, we didn't have anyone in our direct space that knew anything about VR, but because we had Strivr and we had, our technology team along with us, we were able to do the main part of the training that we needed to do and had our tech experts surrounding us. Over time, we got more comfortable with that and didn't need that. But initially, that startup, I think it was great because we didn't have to make up the answers, the questions around VR that we didn't know anything about from a technology standpoint, about the experience, about what had been done before, what could go wrong, what might we do. So having those experts as part of that, was good. The setup, the communications before and after, is also really important because now you're setting expectations as well. So I think just having some openness to not knowing everything. You have your way of doing things. You do your setup. You have your communications. You have all of that. But just being open to say, okay, this is new, and to let especially your pilot group know that this is new and we've never done this before. So there's going to be some learning together. So, I think it's, if anyone was going to try this, I would say absolutely try it, but just be open and know that you could, depending on where in the world you're operating, you can run into issues you didn't even think about.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of things to consider, and it's one of the things that you mentioned about just kind of going out there and being willing, right? Learn along the way a little bit. I do think one of the things that we offer at Strivr is now we have such a kind of composite of all these customer experiences, so we've been able to basically use that experience to hopefully expertly guide organizations going forward with some of these kind of new challenges that they might face in implementing a new technology. And it's, I guess, part of the implementation process too, as we kind of go thinking about more about the training that we were talking about just a little bit ago, is how do you even know like what to choose to train on, right? So I'll think about that from a few different perspectives. So one is a lot of training is going on all the time. So what is it about the current training that you would say, oh, VR is going to be a good kind of like addition here or improvement?
I think our reason for choosing VR for this particular topic is that we were trying to replicate something that was impossible to replicate in another way. So when we looked at the idea of how we simulated or modeled a particular behavior from a certain customer, we just couldn't do that. So it fell into that category of didn't matter how we tried or the many different ways that we did it, it just wasn't sinking in. And so, we like to think about where we are from a learning perspective in terms of evolution. We want to think about how can we get the employee as close as possible to the reality of the job that they're about to do. So in some places we call that an apprenticeship. Sometimes we call that just job immersion. In this situation, we had barriers of culture, of just unexpected, oh my goodness, what's going to happen on this call, and in so many different ways. So to capture that and practice that, it became near impossible to do that. If you operate in a global space, there are sometimes what happens that you make assumptions that everybody is the same as you are based on where you are. So if I'm here in New York, and if I haven't traveled enough, I may think that customers are just customers no matter what, and people are people no matter where they are. Not necessarily true. There are significant enough differences that sometimes without being in a situation, it's hard to imagine or play out that situation. But when you're in it, it's too late because now you're live in production on the job, right? So we found that it was difficult to replicate that scenario with the customer because the scenarios were so many and the customers were so varied and the cultures were so different. So that's why we thought VR might be the answer, and we were right, but we didn't know because we had never done it before. But we thought we didn't have a whole lot to lose, so we wanted to try it.
And I think that's a pretty common theme that we see across the board too, is are these scenarios when choosing kind of like where to start with VR. It's not necessarily that like a lot of customers are like, oh, I want to use VR and now I'm going to go try to figure out a use case for it, right? It's more that there's a need. Yeah. Something that
we knew what we were looking for, though. We knew that we were wanting to grab the emotions of the employee. We wanted them to feel a certain, urgency. And so we had seen a previous VR scenario where an active shooter scenario where you felt like you were being shot. And how do you feel that? And you can't really do that too much by just telling somebody about it, by just watching a video, right? We saw when people watch videos, it'd be like watching a movie and you're sitting back and watching, but there's no effect. And we wanted the effect to happen, in the stomach. So we knew we wanted to elicit that from a person. So that's as much as we knew, but we didn't know that it would really work from an empathy perspective.
Yep, and like I mentioned, I think that's one thing that we're seeing, especially in the soft skills space, is exactly that, kind of customers coming to us wanting to replicate that, and you mentioned kind of feeling it in the gut. This medium, I think, done well, can actually provide that in a lot of cases. And then so thinking about, where the journey goes from here, and thinking about things like global expansion of the particular module that you guys are using, or modules that you're using to train for this. I guess take me through the decision making. So you mentioned just a second ago, like we're not sure if VR is actually going to do this. We think it could, and it's a hypothesis to test. What kind of data or evaluation were you looking at to say, like, this is actually better than, kind of what we've been doing before? What were kind of the key things to choose to kind of use that, evaluation to say this makes sense to do this at a broader scale, that VR is actually working?
I think, so when we started out, we were looking at a global organization. So even though the trial was done in one place, we had the opportunity to have people from different locations, whether the US or otherwise, put the goggles on. Because I could tell you initially, I don't think many people believe that had never used VR before unless they played games, didn't really understand what the difference was going to be until we literally took it to one of our top leadership meetings and had a lot of people put the goggles on. Said, let's just try it, just put it on, right? So as they put it on and got engaged and realized that, wow, this is amazing, it wasn't hard for them to say, yeah, absolutely. In fact, we had more people wanting us to do it than we could, support all at once. So it's just having people try it was one way that we had everybody then wanting us to do it. But the other thing was, I think just probably being a trusted partner with our business owners, they've all been going through similar types of training. Most frontline functions experience similar issues with customer contact. So trying something different, people are usually open to doing that, to see what can be improved, because we live by that. That's what drives a lot of our performance. So I think those were some of the ways that we looked at it and said, we have to put it in front of people and put it in their hands for them to determine whether or not they wanted to do it. From an L&D perspective, there were other ideas and uses, of VR where we were starting to see interest being built up around the company. So it was, I think it was more, you introduce a new technology, you see it starts to catch on, you look at what is happening as you start to build out programs, and whether or not they look different, they're having a different effect. Employees are coming back saying, yes, this is working, this is better. So I think, I don't know if I have any particular ones and zeros to say, gosh, 10% increase in productivity here, or a 20% gain in efficiency, at this time, compared to the interest that grew through the people using it and through the leaders experiencing it themselves and wanting their teams to go through that, because as they felt the effect, they thought that this would be very useful for their front line. And it was across the board feedback was similar from the leaders.
That's great insight certainly for me. And then I think, for other folks for listening to think about what are the things that really compel, right, for this to get adopted at a broader scale, and how are you guys are thinking about evaluating things like effectiveness. And I think that's great.
I think the technology itself is compelling.
So thinking about then, I guess, future states, right? So I think you gave us a great summary of kind of what you guys have done and all the different facets that are involved in that. Thinking about, what next steps might look like, what are other opportunities for this technology that you see, or even within this particular domain of soft skills and customer interaction. I guess just kind of open-endedly, I'd love to hear you riff on some thoughts for the future.
Yeah, the future is bright. I think, we've been having conversations recently around the change in, I would say a change in how people feel about the way we deliver learning. And unfortunately forced upon us, right, by this whole COVID situation that we're going through. It's a pretty incredible time for everyone. And when we think about, I don't know, now and even 6, 9 months, 18 months from now, sometimes it's hard to think, much further than that. There are a couple of things that are happening. One is, as we've stayed home for a long time and as we've experimented with a long time altogether, and we've experimented with things like, homeschooling and distance learning and so on. And as we in corporate America have had to do distance learning and look for different ways to do it, we find that our learners and our business owners are more accepting of trying different ways of doing things. The big challenge that I see is the skill practice that we've come to depend on ourselves to do, and in-person contact to get that done well, repeating that, the need for us to model and watch each other do things. That's kind of how we've always been. That is not only, I wouldn't say it's going away, but the shift in thinking around, well, how do we still become effective without the way we did that, but we still need that. So there's still a need for skill building and for practice. But because we can't get with each other, and even if when we're together, we still have to do social distance, and it's not the same. The good news is we're very optimistic about the power of 5G and the type of connections that we can get from a distance. So that now we have a huge need for distance learning. How might we take something like VR, technology like VR, and power that in a way that it doesn't matter where you are in the world, we can literally deliver complex content to that edge, to where you are. So that's what excites me about the future. Even though we're going through a pretty hard and sad time around COVID, it has sort of given us an opportunity to think about what we might be doing differently in our future with technologies like VR, but with the power of 5G and other type of incredible investments like that. So that's what I see happening in the future is distance learning will look and feel very different. It will, I don't think anything necessarily gets replaced, but it will play a much more significant role in how we do skill building and how we provide immersion so that you don't feel like because you're sitting in Asia or Europe or in the US and the source of the content is somewhere else, or the heartbeat of the company is somewhere else, that you're not getting, what you need because of distance. So we're starting to think about how we take a combination of all these technologies and look at distance learning in a very different way in a way that when we tossed around the words digital and transformation pre-COVID, it meant that that was an aspiration over time. I think now it's a now, and we need to do this, and we need to figure it out and figure it out faster. So I think VR is going to be one of the amazing tools, but that's going to be made possible because we have strong network connectivity coming our way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, and I appreciate that insight around kind of, marrying what we think is a really powerful technology, but making it even more powerful with other technologies, like what you guys are offering as well. So it paints a nice picture for the future. So thanks for that insight. And, I want to thank you for sitting down with us and letting us pick your brain a little bit and sharing the incredible wisdom that you have learned over the course of working with Strivr and working in the space of VR and implementing that in your L&D role. And there's just some pretty amazing stuff coming out of here, certainly when it applies to soft skills. And we're excited to see kind of what comes next with Verizon. So thanks a lot for chatting with us. Really appreciate the time, Cleo.
It's been a great partnership with Strivr, and thanks for having me. It's been great talking with you.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So that was a great discussion. Hope you guys got a lot out of that, learning about how we're applying immersive learning to our soft skills work, and especially the work we did with Verizon. If you guys want to find out more about our approach to immersive learning, we have a guide, the ultimate guide, in fact, that's available on our website. So please check it out. The link is in the presentation. And thank you for joining. Hopefully this was good for you. I know it was a great insight for me. So hope to see you guys soon. Thanks again.